all normal conversation. Friends do not always talk of high and weighty matters. Previously, we have been too concerned with other matters for any emotional interchange. And if Rupert's voice sounds rather dreary in this transitional phase, I myself am in a very playful, you might say frisky, mood. By all means, ask any questions you have in mind. As Seth, I paused, smiling, looking Rob directly in the eye. Rob was newly surprised at the deep voice that had started up again, and it took him a minute to think of something to ask. Besides, he was still laughing at Seth's jovial manner and the humorous gestures and voice inflections that were so unlike mine. Do you have friendships on your plane as we do here? I have friendships, of course. The one thing about your plane that makes it such a tempting field of endeavor for us here is that some of us still have ties of an emotional kind, and we attempt, though often clumsily, to make contact with old friends. As you write letters to friends in strange countries and do not forget them, so we do not forget. Rob asked several other questions, and the two of them, Rob and Seth, chatted back and forth for 3/4 of an hour. About the voice, Seth said, Rupert's voice is an experiment. The immediacy of our sessions would be enhanced if more of my personality could come through. I could go on happily, you might say blithely, for hours, but I shall not. I am not some old fogey. Now and then, old Frank Withers comes through simply because he was the latest independent materialization and is used to taking things upon himself. I have not assimilated him completely, but you can believe me, I intend to. Here Rob started laughing again. Seth had spoken jovially, but not maliciously, about Frank Withers. The tone of his voice and broad smile softened the actual words spoken. Rob made a comment about Seth's attitude, and Seth said, I'm afraid I haven't learned humility yet. On the other hand, you knew me before I knew Frank Withers, and my vanity then was astounding. You were quite vain yourself, and as a woman, you certainly put your present wife to shame as far as vanity is concerned. He was referring, of course, to some reincarnational data he had given earlier. Eventually, we learned that Seth, Rob, and I were part of an ancient entity. This will be discussed in chapters 14 and 15. Seth was also to say later that this past relationship was partially responsible for our communications. As the give and take between Rob and Seth continued, Rob got used to the voice and really enjoyed himself, there being no doubt in his mind now that Seth was Seth, someone entirely different and independent. The impression Rob got from the voice, gestures, and manner was that of an energetic, educated gentleman of the quote-unquote old school, in his 60s perhaps, extraordinarily intelligent but aware of his own foibles, a man with a highly developed yet old-fashioned sense of humor. As Seth, I touched the begonia plant, one of my favorites, and said, I like Jane's plant. Green things are a touchstone of your existence. You notice that earlier I used the term plane rather than planet, because you do not have the whole kettle to yourself. I fear that as a man's voice, Jane will sound rather unmelodious. I do not have the voice of an angel by any means, but neither do I sound like an asexual eunuch, which is all I've been able to make her sound like tonight. And Rupert, if you want a cigarette, get one. She's been walking around with a match in her hand for the last 10 minutes. I don't recall any of this, but according to Rob, I then got a cigarette and sipped a glass of wine. If I could have a glass of wine with you and enjoy it, I would. If you want to talk for a few moments without the necessity of taking notes, do so. I'll certainly last as long as Rupert will, and a lot longer. And if ever your wife's features change some night as we talk, I suggest you do not mention it to her until the end of the session. Seth went on until past midnight. The remark about the change in my features was included in the notes, of course, but it was otherwise forgotten until a year later, when it was brought rather forcibly to mind. When the session was over, my own voice was still fresh and clear, with no trace of the earlier difficulties. I wasn't even tired. Again, on reading the notes, we were fascinated by the material, particularly since Seth told us that he was going to explain these inner senses more fully and teach us how to use them. He was as good as his word, for, as you will see shortly, he did give us instructions, and we were to have all kinds of new experiences as we followed them. We didn't know that this information was geared to our own level of understanding, and quite simple in comparison with the elaborations that would follow. We didn't realize either that the emergence of the Seth voice completed the psychic structure through which we would receive the Seth material, and through which Seth's personality would express itself. From this session on, there was always some voice change during sessions, but the deep booming tones were the exception rather than the rule for some time to come. On occasion, there is the sense of really tremendous power behind the voice, and my own voice is never strained. Much later, Seth told us that this psychic energy can be translated into sound like this, or it can be used for other purposes. Now, when Seth gives clairvoyant material, for example, the voice is seldom loud. The energy is used to gather the data instead. As you will see later in this book, that energy can also be a springboard into other dimensions. When the voice is deep and booming, I feel very small and surrounded by terrific energy. From what we have learned, the voice was a sort of indication of the amount of energy available. It served many purposes, besides helping to express Seth's personality. Looking back, though, it does seem that with the initial emergence of the Seth voice, the structure of the sessions was completed. Even the basic principles of the material had been given in highly simplified form, the blocks upon which the foundations would be laid. Talk about psychic explosions! Our first Ouija board session had been on December 2nd, 1963. By the end of January, we had 20 sessions and some 230 pages of typewritten material. We knew that the voice change was significant, of course, but we didn't realize that the power behind the voice was the most important issue. We saw that the sessions had a kind of order, but its significance escaped us. Actually, the structure provided continuity and stability, but also was flexible enough to nurture latent developments of which we were then completely unaware. Within it, my own training as a medium would take place safely. At this point, there were several courses we could have taken. We could have told no one what was happening, we could have contacted a spiritualist group, or we could have informed the parapsychologists. We definitely decided not to tell any of our friends or relatives, at least for the time being. The spiritualist groups would have been out in any case because of my views at the time on religion in general. But the ESP books we'd read all advised that anyone having such experiences contact a qualified psychologist or parapsychologist. As a result of Seth's instructions, both of us began to have some clairvoyant experiences on our own, and we thought we should write to someone who knew more about such matters than we did. Besides, there was the pressing question: was Seth part of my subconscious? Could the psychologists tell us? So we decided to contact a parapsychologist who would have a knowledge of ESP and psychology. I guess I'd do the same thing if I had it to do over, but I'm not sure. The next few chapters will deal with our efforts to be quote-unquote scientifically responsible, to quote-unquote test Seth for ESP. We didn't really come to any overall decision, but I think that I was driven by the need to make all of this intellectually or academically legitimate. It was, of course, but I had a lot to learn.